Story 1. We used to have a lakeside house where we stored extra fish in the freezer. Sometimes we didn't visit it for a month or so, depending on how busy we were. Unfortunately, the freezer broke for a month without us knowing. We ended up having to throw away the entire freezer. Story 2. I worked in reproductive health care for almost 2 decades. We removed an intrauterine device with 10 years of head hair tangled in a knot in the device's string. It was about the size of a pea and it was potent. Story 3. I used to work on a potato farm. I have encountered various unpleasant odors, including dead bodies and fresh waste. The worst smell I ever experienced was from rotting potatoes. They decay from the inside out, and you cannot always tell until you touch them. The texture resembles mucus, and as soon as the potato bursts, you are hit with a smell similar to a mix of crushed tonsil stones, feces, and vomit, leaving no escape as it gets on your gloves. Story 4. A man had been deceased for 2 weeks in the middle of his kitchen floor. The liquid waste from his body had hardened his pants to the floor. He was a chain-smoking hoarder. It was a 95-degree day in the south, and he did not have air conditioning. All the windows were closed. To add to the smell, there were rotten open wounds that his cats were feeding on, as well as the ammonia odor from the cats urinating everywhere. The bodily fluids seeped under the vinyl flooring in the kitchen to the subfloor. Story 5. My dog dug up a 3-year-old unbroken duck egg from the compost heap, broke it, ate it, and rolled in whatever was left. She vomited and had accidents for a week. That smell does not wash off anything. Story 6. In college, my roommate borrowed my car to go shopping. Several days later, I noticed a strange smell in the car. Upon investigating, I discovered a package of chicken breasts under one of the seats. They had fallen out of his shopping bag and my roommate didn't notice. Raw chicken sitting in a hot car for several days is not something I recommend experiencing. Story 7. Not the worst, but I owned a pizza restaurant a few years ago. A customer called and asked for a very special pizza. He wanted red sauce mixed with chocolate sauce from our dessert pizza as a base, topped with pepperoni, sausage, and anchovies. He wanted it finished with sunflower seeds from the salad bar and Parmesan cheese. I told him that I wouldn't make that combination until he arrived and paid first. So he did. I'm not sure what kind of reaction took place in my oven, but it cleared the place out. I held my shirt over my mouth while cutting the pizza. I handed it to him at the drive-thru window, and that customer took a big bite right there. I never want to smell that again for as long as I live. Story 8. A man in the shoe store, clearly hungover, let out a loud fart while I was trying on shoes, and I could taste it. I will never forget that experience. Story 9. A dead body was shut in with 3 Labradors for 10 days. Excrement from the starving dogs combined with the decomposing body, which was my brother. Story 10. Blue tempera paint had been forgotten under a sink for years. It smelled both dead and alive at the same time. Story 11. I shadowed a doctor in a family medicine clinic. A patient came in complaining of foot pain. It was revealed that he hadn't removed his shoes or socks for several years and was unaware of what was happening underneath. The doctor took off the man's shoes and socks, and particles filled the air. I was almost overwhelmed, trying not to breathe. The smell was both pungent and oddly sweet. Story 12. An entire lake of dead fish was struck multiple times by lightning, killing everything in it. Thousands of fish floated everywhere. Story 13. The smell that comes from a dog's anal glands resembles copper and pain. I have encountered plenty of odors that are more disgusting, nauseating, or repulsive, but this is the only one that actually causes pain. Story 14. Back in the late 1980s, I worked for an ambulance company in a rural area that had a contract with the coroner's office to transport deceased individuals. One day in the middle of August, I was sent out to pick up a body. Upon arriving at the scene, fire and sheriff personnel were present. They informed me that the body was in a camper. The deceased individual was morbidly obese and had been dead for at least 2 weeks. The temperatures had been in the 90s and 100s during that time, and there was no air conditioning in the camper. I spent 30 years as a paramedic and firefighter. This was the worst smell I have ever encountered. After dropping the body at the coroner's facility, I could not get the odor out of my nose for hours. Story 15. We were making a dump run one time when someone left a dead horse on the platform. They simply dumped it and left it there in the city. I was astonished by where it had even come from. The smell was unbearable. Story 16. A dead cat was thrown in the public garbage. I could smell the decay from a kilometer away. I have a strong stomach, but while doing landscaping, I had to step aside and vomit. Story 17. I was in the hospital and was wheeled past another patient, an elderly man, who I believe was dealing with Clostridium difficile because there was a team of nurses cleaning him. The smell was overwhelming. I had to ask for a new mask afterwards. Story 18. My friend went out of town once, and while he was gone, a raccoon ended up burrowing under some clothes in the back seat of his car and died. It sat there for 3 days before he returned, during the hot and muggy 4th of July weekend. When he got back, the floorboards of the car were infested with maggots. We had to remove them by using a shop vacuum hose against the floor until the vibrations caused them to rise from the carpet. The smell never went away, and he sold the car for parts. However, we had to drive it around for about a month, covering our noses the whole time. Story 19. I don't think I can surpass the autopsy cases, but I work in veterinary medicine, and when I tell you I know what it smells like when an animal defecates blood, it's not an exaggeration. I had to perform a fecal examination on this sample, and it smelled like I had stuck my entire face into a moist bag of warm pennies. It was almost unbearable knowing its origin. I also know what kidney disease smells like in cats, and it is frustrating to have that knowledge before the blood results come back. Kidney disease is something I will never be able to recover from either. Story 20. Not necessarily the worst, but the most persistent and damaging. Ground Zero, New York City, on September 13, 2001. It smelled like crushed drywall, mildew, smoke, kerosene, and rotting meat. Burning buildings have a fairly unique but distinctive smell. Any firefighter can take a whiff and know reasonably well if it's a structure fire or a campfire. This had a smell all of its own. The smell got into my nose and just stayed there. For 2 to 3 months, anytime I sneezed hard, I smelled it. Over a year later, I was driving a garbage truck, which has a whole symphony of smells, and we picked up a pile of construction debris at an old pizza place undergoing renovation. It smelled so much like that smell, less kerosene and more grease, that I started shaking and had to sit down for a while. Story 21. When I was a child, my friend and I discovered a dead, bloated, and decomposing deer in the creek. Then the ground gave way beneath me, and I fell 6 feet down into the creek, face down onto the deer. It smelled even worse after it burst. Story 22. As an environmental engineer, I have encountered a wide range of unpleasant odors that stand out for different reasons. When asked, "What do you actually do?" I often respond, "I experience a lot of smells." I once toured a municipal wastewater treatment plant where the headworks and bar screens were located in a closed building for off-site odor control. Opening that door unleashed the strongest smell I've ever encountered. The facility operators mentioned that people have even passed out upon entering due to the odor. During a week of work at a creosote railroad tie treating plant, I was involved in a groundwater recovery system that pumped up about 150 years worth of unknown chemicals historically used. The smell was overpowering, and it seemed to linger with me for the entire week, as if it had ingrained itself in my senses. I also completed an internship at an environmental laboratory, where I was preparing hydrochloric acid, HCl, standards. I caught a whiff of hydrogen chloride gas from the fuming hydrochloric acid I was working with, which can irritate the mucous membranes in the nose and quickly transform into hydrochloric acid. While it didn't cause serious injury, my sinuses were sore for a week. Additionally, we conducted an inspection related to spill prevention, control, and countermeasure regulations at a tannery with a rendering plant. To illustrate the experience, they had regulated blood tanks and other unpleasant features. The junior engineers and geologists drew straws to avoid this challenging assignment. Currently, I work at an oil and gas facility, where the worst odors I encounter are hydrogen sulfide, which is immediately dangerous at certain levels, and light aromatics such as benzene, known for long-term health risks like cancer. The typical smells of sludge and hydrocarbons are nowhere near as bad as the ones I have experienced in my past roles. Story 23. I am a veterinary technician, so I have plenty of experiences to share. One of the most unforgettable cases involved a dog that had gotten into its owner's cannabis stash a few hours earlier. The dog became extremely hungry and searched the entire yard for feces to eat for about half an hour before showing signs of toxicity. As soon as they realized the dog was stumbling due to the missing cannabis, they rushed it in. We had to induce vomiting to prevent further absorption of THC. The dog vomited an enormous amount, creating a strong odor in a small room. The smell was unforgettable. In summary, cannabis and dog vomit. Story 24. A homeless woman in her mid-20s in Los Angeles. My wife and I were in a sandwich shop when she entered. The odor was overwhelming and intense. It burned my eyes and nose. I felt deep sympathy for her. She sat down at a table across the room, but the smell was inescapable. I have never experienced such an intense and unpleasant odor in my life. The smell was so strong it felt like it was penetrating my mind. The manager had to call the police to ask her to leave. We got our food and attempted to eat in the car, but we couldn't. Both my wife and I could still smell the odor for days afterward, as if it had coated the inside of our noses. Story 25. I have never smelled a dead body, but the worst thing I have encountered is the public bathrooms on the Great Wall of China. I went on a 3-week study tour of the Silk Road, where we were warned that the toilets are different and that we should always have toilet paper, especially at the tourist spots. No one informed me that you cannot flush the toilet paper because their sewer lines cannot handle it, so you place the used toilet paper in a trash can beside the toilet. It was July with 95% humidity and 105-degree weather, and it felt like everyone's waste was essentially cooking in those trash cans. Air fresheners would thrive in that environment. Story 26. My wife and cousin, both nurses, once had a discussion in front of me. The winner was festering anal warts. My aunt ended the discussion when she noticed I looked very pale. Story 27. There is a large amount of meat in the freezer in the garage. I opened the garage to discover that the power was out. The meat spoiled, and the smell was terrible. Story 28. The portable toilet I opened a year ago at this shooting range in Western Maryland smelled like a dead body. Probably hadn't been cleaned out all year. Story 29. Cleaned out a couple of seafood restaurants that were destroyed in Hurricane Ian once. We were allowed back on the island. It was 2 weeks after the storm, in 90-degree Florida weather. Not great. Story 30. I went to clean out my dad's car for $25 and found a cabbage under a pile of items in the middle of summer. When I told him he needed to remove the cabbage because I refused, his response was, "I was wondering where that went. I lost that months ago." Story 31. My friend's dog was playing with a skunk and got sprayed just before entering the house. The smell was so bad it made my friend and me start heaving almost immediately. Story 32. I had a friend in elementary school whose dad would eat McDonald's, smoke cigarettes, and travel with their dog in the car. I still remember the smell. A combination of old McDonald's fries, stale cigarette smoke, and a wet dog. Story 33. I was on guard duty in Afghanistan at an Afghan-American base. This base was in the province of Paktia near the city of Gardes. We weren't doing much, but Afghan soldiers went out constantly. One day, they encountered severe casualties. They loaded the bodies of the deceased soldiers into the vehicles and drove past my guard post. With how hot it gets in Afghanistan and the sight of multiple bodies stacked together, it was disturbing. Story 34. One summer, my dad loaned me to his farmer friend for manual labor. One of the first tasks he assigned me was to scoop out compacted, rotten corn from the bottom of a grain silo. I have encountered child vomit and feces, pet messes, and pig farmers who hadn't showered in decades. I have seen roadkill, but none of these experiences compare to the concentrated odor of what that silo smelled like in the Iowa summer heat. Story 35. A charred human. He was involved in a car accident, when his Jeep rolled over and caught fire with him behind the wheel. Story 36. I had to assist with the birth of a stillborn calf that was halfway out of a cow in August after she had been missing for a few days. Story 37. A deceased individual has a ruptured bowel. A clot forms in an artery supplying the colon, causing that section to die and subsequently fill with fecal matter before rupturing. The odor is a combination of decay, feces, and infection. I am part of the surgical team attempting to address this issue. The smell lingers in your sinuses for days afterward. Story 38. A dead body had been found in a canal in Florida. I was there as they pulled him out on the far opposite side. I try to forget what he looked like. I can't allow myself to think about it. But the wind picked up as they hoisted him out, and there was no other smell as bad as that. I threw up. It was truly that bad. I felt sorry for him that his life ended in a canal, and that we were all gawking. It made me feel a little ashamed because he was someone's child who deserved dignity and respect. If I am ever in the same position again, I won't look or react. I will just pray in my heart for their family. Story 39. When my school took a World War I memorial trip to northern France and Flanders in 2017, a student ate too much ice cream in Ypres and vomited all over another student's shoes. When the last post-ceremony at the Menin Gate started, everyone was confused about the smell. I tried not to breathe too much. We later discovered the truth. Story 40. I work with individuals with disabilities, and one of my clients experiences difficulties with bowel movements. The worst smell I have encountered is feces that have been sitting in underwear for 8 hours or more. It develops a sour odor. Story 41. I used to work in a meat plant, which was very difficult in the summer. I had a friend who kept 9 ferrets in a one-bedroom flat. The smell was unbearable. Story 42. Rotted raw chicken. The freezer broke during my 2-week honeymoon in June years ago. The smell was horrific. Story 43. Driving a drowning victim to the crematorium a week after he passed in the heat of summer smelled like fermenting fruit. That was over 30 years ago, and I can still recall that smell. Story 44. My mother was dog-sitting recently, so I went to say hello. The puppy in question sat on my stomach, put her backside in my face, and proceeded to fart. And it wasn't a quick one either. Story 45. Back in college, my roommate had a pet lizard. One day, while we were in class, the lizard vomited a mouse it had been eating. The dead mouse baked under the lizard's heat lamp all day. When I returned to our room, the smell assaulted my nose. I cleaned up the dead mouse, but the odor still lingered. Fortunately, some friends in our hall had plenty of air freshener and incense. Story 46. This is a challenging situation, but I am a nurse, and I used to work at a facility for clients living with traumatic brain injuries. We had one client who could only move his hand, but he always managed to reach for his private areas. One night, I was the manager on shift, and the certified nursing assistants called me to his apartment because they suspected one of his tubes was leaking. I immediately realized it wasn't his tube. He had gotten to himself multiple times, resulting in a significant amount of old fluid in his brief, which had not dried up. The smell was overwhelming. I cannot adequately describe it. I ran outside and vomited. Even after working in various fields of nursing, to this day, nothing compares to the nauseating smell of that old fluid. That was also the only time I have ever vomited in my career. Story 47. An elderly woman living alone in an apartment passed away. She had been in that apartment for about 3 weeks before she was found. The heat in mid-August and all the windows tightly shut without air conditioning made the situation worse. As soon as we arrived, the building maintenance staff mentioned that neighbors had started complaining about the odor. We were already aware of it. He opened the door, and at least a couple of hundred flies swarmed out. The smell was overpowering. It remains with me to this day. Story 48. My dad worked in forensics and often had to store items from crime scenes at his business. On one occasion, he had a couch from an elderly person's home. The individual had passed away while lying on the couch, and to make matters worse, their air conditioning broke down during a heat wave. The body essentially became one with the couch, resulting in an unpleasant situation. When I worked for him part-time in college, I unfortunately had to help move that couch. Produced the most rancid smell I've ever encountered. Imagine the scent of the most rotten meat you've ever smelled, multiplied 1,000,000 times. A smell so bad it permeates every fiber of your being. I would not recommend it. Story 49. A calf that had been dead for about 4 days inside a cow in the middle of summer produced an awful odor when it was finally removed. Story 50. I interned in a hospice and assisted the wound nurse. One patient had serious wounds that no one else wanted to help with. The smell was so strong and piercing that it took about 4 showers to remove it from my body. Story 51. A dead deer was found in the front seats of a car during the peak of summer in Alabama. It had been there for at least a week before we encountered it at my job. It remained for another week until biohazard cleaners arrived to handle the situation. I can't forget the smell and the visuals when I had to take close-up pictures of it to prove it was a biohazard in order to get the cleaners out. Story 52. I worked at a thrift store where people would drop off items after hours, and our policy required us to dispose of them. We often turned away items during open hours, such as strollers and car seats. One night, a man dropped off a large chest freezer. We couldn't sell it, and we also couldn't dispose of it until the refrigerant was handled. Unfortunately, that took a few days. It did not occur to any of us that the freezer was full. When we tilted it onto its side to place it on a dolly, dozens of once frozen fish that had been decomposing inside during a hot Norfolk, Virginia summer spilled out all over the gravel. The thick, humid Norfolk air absorbed every odor and lingered. It soaked into the gravel lot. We cleaned that spot with water and soap 3 times a day for a solid month. Story 53. Death. My grandfather died in my arms, and the thick brown liquid that oozed from his nose and mouth, and some from his eye, smelled incredibly rancid, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. I could still smell it every day for about 2 weeks. I continue to have nightmares about it. Story 54. My friend played games on a computer and would sit there for days without getting up, not even to go to the bathroom. She would just continue playing. Story 55. My chest freezer tripped a breaker while we were on vacation. It sat in our unair-conditioned garage for a week during a July heat wave. We returned home after a lovely time away and immediately smelled the horror with the windows up. I knew better than to open the freezer at that moment, so I flipped the breaker and let everything refreeze. When I went to clean it out, it still smelled terrible. The garage smelled unpleasant for 6 months. Story 56. A clogged urinal needed to be fixed as it was part of my job, and it was the most unpleasant mix of body fluids I have ever smelled. Not only was the odor repulsive, but I learned that different urine has different densities, which causes it to separate into various shades of yellow and brown, much like oil in water. Story 57. I dated a football player in high school, and one day after practice, we started fooling around before he showered. He pushed my head down, and I ended up getting sick in his lap. As a Chicagoan, he ruined Italian beef sandwiches for me forever because somehow his body odor reminded me of an Italian beef dipped in chicken noodle soup, left out behind a dumpster for a week in 90-degree heat. I've never encountered anything that smelled that bad since. Story 58. My dad had a brain aneurysm with only a 10% chance of success if he underwent surgery. My mom decided to go with the alternative option and see if his body could recover on its own. Unfortunately, it did not work. He was essentially brain dead after a few days, and his body began to decompose in the hospital bed. I will never forget that smell for the rest of my life and how soft his hands felt. Story 59. My dog has a food intolerance that prevents proper digestion, resulting in bloody diarrhea and extremely unpleasant gas. The smell is similar to sweet eggs and lingers in the air and on the walls, taking hours to dissipate. So bad that when he passes gas, he often leaves the room. Story 60. The commercial garage disposal drain line was disconnected from the wall. They continued using it for a few weeks until they realized something was wrong. It was not just the smell, but also the presence of maggots, which was definitely disgusting. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.